In 1987, we got a hip, stylishly directed movie about an aimless young man who was seduced by a beguiling young woman, only to discover that he is well on his way to joining her and her motley group of friends as a vampire. In order to protect his family, he'll have to risk everything to fight back. That movie, of course, featured this guy. Was released on July 31st of 1987 and was titled The Lost Boys. Just over 2 months later, on October 4th, 1987, we got a hip, stylishly directed movie about an aimless young man who was seduced by a beguiling young woman, and yeah, you get the picture. Near Dark flatlined at the box office despite some very positive reviews. But once it hit VHS, it found its audience and clawed its way into a cult classic hit. Now, almost 40 years later, yeah, I know that hurts. Does it live up to its rep? Or once all that nostalgia is stripped away, does it lack bite? Let's find out right now on Gen X Movie Reviews Old School Rewind.
The night has its price.
All right. So for a little context, my own personal history with this movie, I remember watching Near Dark in my parents' wood-paneled basement circa about 1990. I was already a huge vampire fan, but I gotta admit, I was still a little leery of horror movies. A few months earlier, I had watched 1988's The Serpent and the Rainbow.
Don't let them bury me. I'm not dead.
Another classic Gen X flick. By myself while my parents were away in that same wood-paneled basement. And I got probably about 3/4 of the way through before I shut it off, ran upstairs, turned on every light in the house, and cowered under a blanket for the rest of the night. But my newfound love for vampire movies made me feel brave enough to take a shot at Near Dark. The Lost Boys is the movie that made me fall in love with vampires. I'm not gonna lie, I wanted to be a vampire so bad in my teenage years. Sleep all day, party all night, never grow old, never die. It's fun to be a vampire has gotta be one of the best movie taglines ever for a Gen X teenager. As a consequence, I watched every single vampire movie I could get my hands on, and still do to this day. Fright Night and its sequel, Monster Squad, Life Force, and of course, Near Dark. I remember being most affected by Near Dark. These weren't cool, hip, sexy vampires or ancient, clever, calculating vampires. No, these vamps were grimy, the dregs of society, outlaws, outcasts, with a desperate edge, no plan, and a bloodthirst that drove them to the edge of insanity. They were anarchists with nothing to live for except that blood high, and their unending time on Earth had clearly driven any humanity out of them. Other than May, who had recently been turned, the rest feel centuries old. Jesse speaks about fighting in the Civil War, and Severin jokes with Jesse about starting the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. It feels like rather than enjoying the promise of immortal life, the ennui has set in, they have nothing to live for, and it is slowly driving them crazy. How the movie is shot, and consequently the movie itself, feels gritty, dirty, and grimy. And Near Dark gleefully, ghoulishly blows up all the romantic tropes, positing vampires as the bottom feeders of society, barely eking out any kind of existence. The vampires use stolen vehicles as DIY makeshift coffins, using tinfoil and black spray paint to keep out the sun. It was a completely different take on the lore, with the word vampire never being uttered once in the film. And it's firmly lodged itself in history as a rule-breaking, chaotic, violent vampire touchstone, the anti-Lost Boys for Generation X. But how does it hold up almost 40 years later? Kathryn Bigelow, who you might remember as the Oscar-winning director of The Hurt Locker, Zero Dark 30, Strange Days, and that Gen X classic, Point Break, here co-writes and directs on her sophomore pick. And despite the obviously limited budget, she demonstrates a sure hand with some epic performances. Beautiful and dynamic action shots. A great sense of chaos and mounting unease. Juxtaposing wide open landscapes with an always threatening sunrise against the cloistered claustrophobic dens of the vampires. Near Dark features superb stunt work, including some incredible firework, almost all completely in camera. Some brutal, palpable, and gruesome VFX makeup work. And that classic 80s soundtrack, discordant, haunting electro synth sound from Tangerine Dream. no less. Now, Catherine Bigelow famously dated and married James Cameron, and there are a lot of elements in this film that feel borrowed from Cameron's work. The most obvious, of course, is she uses 3 actors from Aliens to great effect here in Near Dark. Lance Henriksen, Jeanette Goldstein, and the always phenomenal Bill Paxton. And perhaps the relationship between Cameron and Bigelow was top of mind when I started my rewatch, but I was immediately reminded of Cameron's 1984 The Terminator with the opening of Near Dark. The synth score, the gritty, grimy film 80s look, the composition of the shots all have echoes of the Terminator throughout Near Dark. Even the huge exploding rig that incinerates Severin in the film's third act feels staged and shot in a similar fashion to Terminator's third act. Look, I'm not trying to detract from Bigelow's obvious skill behind the camera, but it's clear she was taking some cues from the best in the business. Supposedly Cameron and Bigelow started dating in '88. But between borrowing some of his cast and cribbing some of his cinematic language, he was clearly making an impression before they officially hooked up. The two went on to collaborate multiple times together even after their marriage had ended. And it's cool to see 2 such dynamic artists lift each other up and share such a passion for cinema. Now, here's where we get into where I think the film falls down a little bit. Catherine Bigelow wrote this film with her longtime collaborator Eric Red. Bigelow stated that she originally wanted to make a Western and grafted the horror genre onto her original script, as Westerns weren't hot at the moment and horrors were getting greenlit. And the actual story of the film, the beats of the character's journey, is where the film falls down for me. The concept and the execution of the characters in the film is excellent, but the script itself doesn't really give many of these gifted actors much to do. I mean, Lance Henriksen is clearly living his part. And he stated that in his downtime on set, he would go out and pick up hitchhikers just to scare the bejesus out of them. He is such a presence in the film. And yet the script gives him so little to actually do. He's the father figure watching over his little vampire family. Yet as a character, he's mostly inert and just remains a presence in the film rather than a catalyst driving the story forward. Everything about Lance Henriksen in the film, his haunted face, his incredible wardrobe, his backstory about fighting in the Civil War, it all just feels like a waste to not give this fascinating character more to do. Jeanette Goldstein as Diamondback and Joshua John Miller as Homer get little moments to shine, as Diamondback plays the den mother to this motley crew, and Homer plays the ancient man trapped inside a child's body. Again, these are fascinating characters that spark the audience's imagination, but the script itself struggles or barely even tries to find anything interesting for these characters to do. The script itself is more focused on moving these characters en masse from point A to point B to point C, rather than giving the characters their own objectives and their own obstacles to overcome. Bill Paxton, of course, fares the best out of this motley group of vampires. He's the primary antagonist in the story. And here Bill was clearly at the height of his powers as the abrasive asshole. Between this, Weird Science, Aliens, and True Lies.
I got a little dick, it's pathetic.
The lore of the film says that Bill came up with some of the best lines in this movie. And while he almost chews the scenery, it's such a committed performance that he pretty much steals the movie.
I hate them when they ain't been shaved.
Adrian Pasdar and Jenny Wright acquit themselves adequately as the leads. It's pretty cool to see Adrian, who we primarily know these days as a character actor, swing for the lead. He's present, believable, and you do root for him as a character. But the script, other than some classic 80s dirtbag behavior masquerading as rascally charm, seriously, he picks up May, drives her to the middle of nowhere, drags her out of the truck, lays hands on her without her showing even a hint of interest or any kind of flirting. Indeed, she rejects him several times. Then he parks the truck, takes out the keys, puts them down his shirt, and insists he won't drive her anywhere unless she gives him a kiss. It's just cringy, hard to watch, and makes it tough for us to root for this guy. Adrian Pasdar's Caleb Colton really is that traditional empty cipher of an 80s lead. And Jenny Wright's May is that classic 80s pixie dream girl who is just there to love the lead and has no true objectives of her own. They don't give her a whole lot of depth, and it really feels like she just exists to kickstart the plot in motion. Jenny Wright does the best she can with the skeleton of a character that she's been given. She's grounded and believable with a haunted, eerie, dangerous quality about her. And the stakes feel high and truthful in all her scenes. But at least for me, her and Adrian lack a palpable chemistry. As I say, in their first scenes, he just comes across as a bit of a creep trying to get in her pants. And it makes it hard to invest in their great love later on when these early scenes are so charmless. There are also some truly questionable, mind-boggling, eye-rolling choices made by the characters, as well as some deus ex machina moments, all in favor of propelling the story forward. For example, Caleb gets cured right before the third act and just goes home and acts normally after screwing these vamps over royally. Caleb and his family don't arm up, protect themselves, or take any kind of action at all. They just sit down to have dinner. And we know from earlier that the vamps know where he lives. Does he really think he's out of harm's way? The script says he does so that we can set up the third act. And the blood transfusions that cure everyone seems super easy, barely an inconvenience. So when we strip away the nostalgia and view Near Dark through the following 37 years of cinema, where does it fall? Viewing it today, I would still give Near Dark a very solid 3.5 stars out of 5. It's a tight, grimy, moody 94-minute ride with a fun, gritty reinvention of some classic movie monsters, recasting vampires almost as junky addicts barely existing on the fringes of society. While I would have appreciated more insight, more character development, more for these compelling characters to do, Near Dark exists as a solid, stripped-down B-movie that aspires to be nothing more than a propulsive, hard-R action horror flick. And here it absolutely succeeds. It is very much a film of its era. A quintessential 80s movie, from its synth soundtrack to its cringy male behavior to its hell-bent economy of story. And yet, as with some of the best filmmaking, there is a timeless element here as well. And I thoroughly enjoyed catching up with Near Dark in 2025. Worth a watch if you've never heard of this movie, or worth a rewatch if it's been 37 years. For me, and this might be controversial, but it definitely doesn't dethrone The Lost Boys as my favorite vampire movie of 1987. But I will give it this, it is definitely my second favorite vampire movie of the 80s.
Pray for daylight.
Now, Near Dark has been famously hard to find over the last few decades, with only sporadic DVD and Blu-ray releases. But I was able to buy or rent it on Apple digitally. All right, I gotta bounce. Thanks for watching this old school rewind on Near Dark. Be sure to like and subscribe, or don't. And hit me up in the comments. Let me know what you prefer, Lost Boys or Near Dark. Later, skaters.